Alright, today we are going to learn about modern and contemporary music. So, for your learning target today, Tuesday, May 1st, describe some innovations composers used that contributed to the growth of music. So, we're going to look at a few composers today, see things that they used, how it moved music forward during our time period. Going to look at some famous people from the 1920s. I'm going to look at some African Americans that helped today. So overall, wrapping up our time period, we'll look at musical composers. So if you have this down, make sure you write it down for Tuesday, learning target side, and make sure that you answer it as we go along the lecture today. So moving on. You should be given another fill in the blank notes to follow along today like we did before. And let's go ahead and begin. Here is Igor Stravinsky. He was born in 1882 to died in 1971. Like many of the people that we've talked about, they were European composers who their influence will travel to the United States. He is one of those people. He was born in Russia. Throughout his lifetime, he will also have French and U.S. citizenship, so kind of dual citizenship. He wrote for ballets. A lot of Russian composers would write for ballets. Like Richard Wagner that we talked about during the Romantic time period, he too used Russian folk stories as inspiration for his ballets. One of the things that you might want to write down for your learning target is that he used unusual harmonies to create a range of emotions. So he's really going to go back and look at Richard Wagner and look at other composers of the Romantic era, see what they use, and get to the emotional core for the audience. Do remember his famous piece. His famous piece is called The Rite of Spring. So you will probably see that on your exam. So once again, Igor Stravinsky, Russian, wrote for ballets, used unusual harmonies, and his favorite and most famous piece was The Rite of Spring. You can see him pictured up here. This is George Gershwin, born 1898, died 1937. He is one of the American-influenced musical composers that we'll look at today. He was born in New York. He will also end up working with his brother Ira on a lot of songs during our time period. His music reflected the unique nature of American society. So he's going to write concertos, symphonies, and music for musicals which were popular during the day. One of the famous musicals that come out during his time period early on was called Porgy and Bess from the early 1900s. One of his most famous pieces is Rhapsody in Blue. This was based on his inspiration from riding a train from New York to Boston, and if you listen to this, you can hear the sights and the sounds of what someone might expect in a industrial city. He uses a lot of trumpets, a lot of horns to try to bring in gridlock, rushing cars, people moving about frantic. This was also featured in Fantasia, the original Fantasia. So we'll see a lot of jazz music in his pieces. And like I told you, his brother Ira worked a lot with him, and they would write songs for Broadway musicals. So just to recap, George Gershwin, American, wanted to reflect American society in his music. Famous piece, Rhapsody in Blues, very much jazz influence, and also wrote musicals for Broadway. Alright, another American, Aaron Copland, 1900 to 1990. American musical composer, wrote music that represented America, and we'll see this in some of his famous pieces to the right. He felt that music needed to be accessible to the general public. This was a time period when they didn't have CD players, they didn't have MP3s and iPods, and that if you really wanted the music of a lot of these composers, especially early in their careers, you had to go buy the sheet music, sit in front of the piano, play it, learn it, and sing it yourself. So really, you would just hear these scores of music if you were in watching a Broadway performance or listen to it on the radio. So some of this was before television. So once again, he wanted music to be accessible to the general public. He also wanted music that he felt could be better understood by everyone. And he uses American folk songs, American stories, and also jazz. So once again, we're going to see another person using jazz, just like we saw George Gershwin. Jazz is really going to come prevalent during this time period, and we will also look at another person and their influence on jazz. So some of his famous pieces you can see over here to the right, and how they represent America. Billy the Kid, classic Western, Lincoln, Portrait, Rodeo, Appalachian Spring. One of his most famous ones was the Appalachian Spring. So very much wanted to showcase America, what we stood for, what we were about in his musical compositions. And so you can see him down here. So that was Aaron Copland, American composer, wanted to get the heart of what the American people were all about. Finally, we're going to wrap up today's lecture talking about Duke Ellington. He was born in 1899, died in 1974. As you can tell from his picture, he was an African American. He was an American-born jazz musician. So we're going to see influence of jazz again. One of the big things with Duke Ellington is that he will come very popular in the 1920s during the Harlem Renaissance in Harlem, New York, where there was a surge of African poetry and artists and musicians and actors, and it was just really their time to shine. So from 1924 to 1932, Duke Ellington, he would be in charge of a band. He would be like the band leader, and they would play at the Cotton Club. And here, down here, you can see a picture of the Cotton Club. The Cotton Club was one of the most famous clubs during the 1920s. A lot of white Americans would go there, and African Americans would be on the stage performing. When I was thinking about the learning target today, I was thinking about Duke Ellington with some of the innovations that he used. Growling. He would sometimes growl when he would perform, and sometimes you would see them using the end of the rubber of a plunger and holding it to the end of their trumpet or the saxophone or any brass horn instrument to kind of get a different, sound. Sometimes they would just use it to mute their instruments. But it was new, innovative, original, and it kind of took off from there. And a lot of other artists would try to mimic Duke Ellington and things that they saw that his band did, at the Cotton Club. Wrote over 1,000 pieces of music. Very successful. Really made the African American community proud. Did wonders with jazz, and so that is why many of his pieces became popular hits and are now considered jazz standards. So when you think of jazz music, if you were to probably Google jazz, it would pull up Duke Ellington and his pieces. So this concludes the lecture today. So once again, do make sure that you answer your learning target. So describe some innovations composers used that contributed to the growth of music. So think back onto the people we talked about today: George Gershwin, Aaron Coppola, just some of the people that we looked at, Igor Stravinsky, wrapping it up with Duke Ellington, and what they did with music and how they might have changed it, and some things that they thought about, and that now we've taken what they've done and perfected it and critiqued it and made it even better today. So this wraps up today.